Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Seasonings webinar. Thank you for joining us. I know the weather is likely beautiful at home. I don't happen to be in Minnesota right now, but I do know just what early June weather can be like. So I appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening. My name is Dr. Abby Schaft. I'm an extension educator for poultry, and my expertise happens to be in biosecurity. And that's exactly why we are here this evening. And I would like to have the rest of our panelists who are with us this evening introduce themselves before we get started. Before we do that, I just want to share with you what tonight's purpose truly is, and that is to keep all of you and all of our animals as healthy as possible as we're entering into our fair season, starting this weekend, and then of course going up to the Minnesota State Fair. And as information, the Minnesota 4-H and Youth Development and Minnesota FFA, all of their exhibitions have been following Minnesota Board of Animal Health guidelines. Many of you can remember in 2015 when poultry exhibitions were canceled because of highly pathogenic avian influenza, and 4-H followed that guidance. And we, as Extension, continue to follow the Minnesota Board of Animal Health for guidance with respect to testing, transportation, moving, and all of our exhibitions. Many of you are involved with putting on exhibitions at county fairs or other shows and know about dealing with the Minnesota Board of Animal Health. So I want to preface that Minnesota 4-H is following the guidance and recommendations put forth by the Minnesota Board of Animal Health with respect to livestock exhibitions at this point in time. And that's what we're going to be sharing about this evening. So if I can have the panelists go ahead and introduce themselves. And Marie, if you would go last and then start off with your information, then we will go from there.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Sharon Davis. I work as Animal Science Director for Minnesota 4-H. I work with the animal science team that you have many of the regional educators throughout the region where you belong. I'm really happy to work with Abby tonight with this webinar. Biosecurity is something in these days we have to pay particular attention to. And as we start our fair season, and as Abby said, I think we have 6 or 8 fairs started up here in the next 2 weeks, and then July just gets really hectic. I just think it's up to all of us to be extra cautious and take some precautions to keep our animals and our families safe.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Amber Greeley, and I'm the Director of State and County Fairs Programs with Minnesota 4-H. And I'm just here to support Abby and Sharon and Marie on this, and making sure that we're getting word out to fairs and fair boards and everybody to keep our fairs safe.
Hi, everyone. I'm Madeline Eaton. I am the communicator for Minnesota 4-H and the Department of Youth Development, and I am here tonight to help moderate the Q&A.
And that leaves me. I'm Dr. Marie Culhane. I'm a veterinarian here at the College of Veterinary Medicine in the University of Minnesota. I've been studying and working with influenza viruses and food animals my entire career as a veterinarian. So happy to speak to you all today. And it looks like I'm going to go. So I'm going to share my screen. And it should look excellent. All right. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for joining me today. It is a beautiful day. And I'd also like to thank my partner here at the University of Minnesota, my team leader, Carol Cardona. She's the Pomeroy Chair in Avian Health. These are primarily her slides. But I added my own touch, and I'm Marie Culhane, and I'm a professor here of veterinary population medicine. So I'm here to give you the background on H5N1 influenza A virus in dairy cattle, and what does that mean? Or just H5N1, what does that mean? So let's get started. All right, so this is what I'm going to go over today. What is flu? Where in the world is flu? How is it moving across the US in cattle and birds and whatever else? What are the rules of influenza? And why should you care about influenza? So with that, let's get started here. So what is influenza, or what is influenza A virus or bird flu? Well, influenza or flu is what I like to call it. It's the disease caused by influenza virus. Now, bird flu is caused by influenza A viruses, and there's other types of influenza, but let's just narrow our talk time together today to influenza A viruses, and then specifically an H5 viruses. So where in the world is bird flu anyway? And I'm not going to call it bird flu anymore. I'm going to call it avian influenza. Okay, so where in the world is avian influenza? Well, Carol likes to show a slide that's the opposite of this. Where in the world is it not? And you can only see there's one country, and that would be Greenland. But it's everywhere. And I want to point on this map, you see a lot of red on the map. You can't make out whether it's a circle for a domestic species or a triangle for a wild animal species, or if it's a human little marching man icon, or if it's an environmental sample. They're all blending together. That's how much avian influenza is out there in the world. And the red arrow is pointing at H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI. But let's talk about that on the next slide. So where in the United States is avian influenza H5N1 in poultry? Well, we've been having an outbreak in the United States of H5N1. That's the subtype of influenza virus we're dealing with. We've been having an outbreak with that since about February of 2022 to today. We have some months where it doesn't seem to be around, but it's been ongoing everywhere in the United States. And so the map on the left is 2022 to today. And green, the darker the state on the map, means the more cases, the more birds, poultry in this case, that were infected. So Minnesota, dark green. And in the last 30 days, this is what got us into the dark green in Minnesota. Minnesota's had a lot of outbreaks in the last 30 days, as has Iowa in our very large farms. So where in the USA is H5N1 in cattle? Because if I kept calling this avian influenza, you'd just think it was a bird problem or an avian problem, but it's not. H5N1, this type of influenza virus, is a problem for multiple species. So where is it in cattle? Where is H5N1 in cattle? Where there's websites that keep these up, and we'll put all these websites in the chat. Looking at this yesterday, 93 dairy farms in 12 states. The red states are the confirmed states where H5N1 influenza was detected in dairy cattle in those states. But let's zoom back into Minnesota. So the current situation, where's H5 influenza in Minnesota? It's in poultry, and it's in our cattle. And at the Board of Animal Health website, which we'll put this in on the chat, there's maps that you can look at and lists that you can look at. And so for turkeys and chickens, we indicate that on the map by circles around the infected poultry houses. So there's infections in Stearns County. You can see here, Stearns 21, 20, 17, 18, 19, the number of birds in those farms that are infected and going to be killed or die because of this virus, and what type of birds they are. Turkeys, turkeys, turkeys. There's a circle in Meeker County for some table egg layers. There's a circle out here in Lyons County. And then that's the circles, the green and blue circles. And then the yellow counties are where H5 has been found in cattle. So Benton, Sibley, and Lincoln. And down at the bottom here is how many animals and when that date of detection was and what animals were in there. Right. And so that's, you can look that up and keep track of that. You can zoom in and zoom out. That's obviously not the whole state on that slide. I zoomed in a little bit to make it fit on the screen. All right. So the next thing I said we were going to talk about is how is it moving? And there's been some really fancy papers out there. And if you go to just the awesome figures in the back, you can see how it's moving and how they figure out how this virus is moving and where it's going is they look at the genetic sequence of the virus. So if you think about, I'm a veterinarian, and so we think about what kind of a dog do I have? And they test the genetic material of the dog, and you find out that your little cute dog is half Doberman and half poodle or something like that. We do the same thing with viruses. We look at the genetic sequence of the virus and we see, where is it and where did it come from and what's it made of? And so they did this, they published this paper right away, the USDA did, and they showed how it moved around. And so March 13th, they had the first detections in Texas. Shortly thereafter, the virus spread to Michigan. And in a month or so after that, it spread all around the United States. And then looking at what the virus is in each of these, they said, well, we don't know how it got into this farm, but it got blue is infected dairy, and from a dairy farm into some poultry in Texas in Deaf Smith County, and then some Texas cattle spread it to Ohio and Michigan and New Mexico. New Mexico and Texas, their viruses are together, but there's been some movement here across the United States. And so we know that cows moved from Texas to Michigan in this case, that there was an animal movement or animal epidemiological link. Right. And then we can say the virus is also linked in those cases as well, that the virus looks the same at those places. So that's how it's moving. It's moving around either by location or by animal movements. Okay. And so that's some things about where we're at today. And you might think, oh my gosh, this is just, it's going everywhere. There's nothing we can do. Well, there are rules of influenza virus, and Dr. Cardoni and I have learned these rules throughout our careers. And then we look at H5, and is H5 influenza following the rules? It used to be a bird virus, and now it is a cattle virus. Is it following the rules? And really getting up to what can you guys do about it? Why should I even care about this? And it's only in a few states or a few farms. Well, I'm going to show you that as well. So let's go over what are the rules of influenza viruses. I'm going to step back here and give you all the rules up front. Influenza viruses, they follow several rules, right? The basic 4 rules are, and there's more than these, but some 4 that I'm going to go over today are, there's many, many hosts, many, many animals, including people, that can get influenza A viruses, that can get infected with them, that can become sick or not, but they can get them. They're called susceptible hosts. Influenza A viruses, if it infects multiple hosts and causes some problems and spreads around, that's called an outbreak. So influenza A viruses, they do cause outbreaks like this current situation. The virus itself is fragile. It's not as tough as it thinks. It's fragile outside the host. Sure, it likes to live in the nose or the lungs and in wet and moist places, but outside of the host, unless the environment is moist and wet, that virus will die. We can disinfect it. We can clear it out of the environment. And different hosts react differently to the same virus. If you ever think about how your whole family has gotten sick after getting together for Christmas, right? Cousin Bob didn't even miss a meal, whereas you were in bed for 3 days, but you had the same exact virus or illness. Different hosts, just in influenza with animals and people, react differently to the same virus. All right, so in rule number 1, there are many hosts of influenza viruses. That's what Dr. Cardona likes to say. I've been marching around the country, well, really the world, and saying influenza is a shared virus. And this recent publication, and I'll put the link to this publication in the chat, just shows you how many different influenza viruses there are. This was published in January. And if somebody wants to put in the chat what species is missing from this picture, because we didn't know it would happen in January. Yep, that's the bovine, which would be right here where my purple arrow is. It'd be right here somewhere. Right, my whole career, I've spent looking at this particular area, this pig, human, and domestic poultry area here with H1s and H3 influenza viruses. But look at all these: cats, dogs, ferrets. I think that's a guinea pig, and emu, horses. Bats have their own influenza viruses, marine mammals, and things like that. Wild birds are the natural hosts, and there's ongoing circulation in these hosts. That's what it means, is circling around. There's ongoing circulation in wild birds. There's ongoing circulation in some areas of the world in poultry. There's ongoing circulation in pigs. This is very true of H1 viruses. And we humans have ongoing circulation of influenza viruses. And then we share them back and forth with each other. Influenzas are shared viruses. Now, just thinking about the diversity on this page, if you looked at your atlas of animals in the world, or which we used to study as kids and things like that, there's about 2,000 bird species in North America and about 1,000 mammal species. So those are all the species out there. We can't experimentally infect each one. We'll never have a complete picture of influenza A virus hosts or how widely it's shared, and we never will. We just have to acknowledge that influenza viruses are shared, and if a animal comes in contact with enough influenza virus, there may be an infection that results. All right, influenza A viruses, they cause outbreaks by two reasons. One, they can infect multiple hosts, and two, they change. And so if the host says, hey, influenza virus, I'm going to fight you and get rid of you out of my body, the influenza virus might change next time. And it does that by a couple of different mechanisms. What we're trying to show here is, here's an H5N6 influenza virus here. Here's an H4N1. It's a segmented genome virus. These are the proteins inside the virus. If they infect one cell, they can exchange virus segments and out comes a new virus. That's called reassortment. And not only do they make these big changes where two influenza viruses get together and exchange genomes and become a new virus, but the virus changes every time it infects a new host. So here's the oval. What if we started off with an influenza virus represented by this black oval? Well, one passage into the turkey in the next pen, the virus changes a little bit. Still an oval, but it's not as black, right? So it's gray. Then it changes again and it changes again. So it changes every time it infects a new host, and it changes a lot when two viruses infect the host and exchange viruses. So why should you care about this? And I'm going to go back to this at the end. We should care about this based on what we've already talked about. The rules is because you're facing an unsteady target. The virus is going to have new features to it or characteristics that is likely going to cause different clinical signs, different illness, different syndromes, or is going to transmit differently. And as the virus changes, it sometimes makes it difficult to detect and difficult to vaccinate against. But we do all this research so we can stay on top of these things. And we're going to expect that this influenza virus, with its changes and its ability to infect multiple hosts, there's going to be new and more types of hosts that are going to be infected. You should care about that based on those 3 slides. But I'm going to give you some good news of why you can care about this, and Abby's going to give you more. Well, the other rule we have to remember about influenza viruses is this virus is very fragile outside the host. When we get all nerdy and we look at influenza viruses as scientists or virologists, we say, ooh, it has an envelope. And the envelope means that disinfectants can bind to that envelope and break it apart. And so therefore, once that enveloped virus, that coating is out there, it dies outside the host. And so here's a long list of disinfectants that don't work on influenza virus. Yeah, there's none. Almost every disinfectant works against influenza virus. And so that's why you'll see claims on bottles of like Lysol or household cleaners that they have a claim against influenza virus. And they do, because this virus is fragile outside the host. However, the influenza virus can survive. Remember, if I said that it's in a wet and cool environment that protects it from light. So here we've got some poop here. So influenza virus inside some poop could survive in there. Influenza virus inside some snot coughed out of a pig's lungs could survive in there. And so we need to exploit So the viruses then like to live in those wet, dark places. And so if your farm has a lot of wet, dark places, or your equipment is wet and dark, it's going to try to survive in there, but you can clean it, disinfect it, expose it to the light, and reduce the amount of influenza virus on that surface. The other rule of influenza virus, and here's a little more good news, is that influenza is a self-limiting disease for some hosts. It is not a self-limiting disease for a lot of breeder hens, breeder turkeys, and chickens, but for some it is. Like for humans, some of them have just gotten conjunctivitis or kind of a pink eye infection. And the cows, a lot of the cows continue to milk, and pigs certainly do quite well with influenza viruses, depending on their overall health and nutrition. And what it means is that even though an animal or a human might feel pretty bad when they get the flu, they usually recover. You can shed a lot of virus during that recovery period. The good news is that cows appear to do well and recover. A lot of supportive care to some cows. I just got an email today. They gave the cows aspirin and electrolytes, and a lot of the cows are doing really well after being diagnosed just 4 or 5 days ago. So they're getting better. So they will get well, and cows are appearing to do well. But I want to remind everybody, the first thing I said, influenza viruses are shared. They infect many, many species. So even though the cows aren't dying or the pigs aren't dying and the human infections have been really mild, this H5 influenza virus in another animal might kill that animal. For example, you might have heard about cats on the dairy farms dying from influenza virus, right? The cow was doing just fine. The cat did not when exposed to the influenza virus. And one thing that we're finding out is there is a lot of influenza virus being shed from cows in their milk. And if we did a little bit of math here, one cow, if she continues to milk and recover from influenza virus until she clears that virus, that one cow will produce enough influenza virus in her milk when she's sick to kill 1 million chickens every day. That's a lot of virus that's out there. But remember, it's fragile. As long as it's not in a wet, moist, dark environment, we can disinfect the virus. We can get it off our surfaces. We can stop spreading it. We can do some things like that. I want to talk to you about a little bit more about things you might have heard in the news. We had goats in Minnesota that had H5 influenza virus back in January, February. And now in May, we have alpacas in Idaho testing positive for H5N1. The alpacas lived on a farm that the birds were infected and dying with H5, and the alpacas got infected, and they did fine. They recovered, but they did get infected. Also some findings in New Mexico, they just tested house mice for influenza virus. And these are the hybrid mouse. They're very rigorous. They're in everybody's houses. They're very strong. They're immune to a lot of things. Those mice have been found to be infected with H5 influenza virus in New Mexico. So there's a lot of species being infected, and we don't know everything that we want to know about H5 influenza in the bovine, but we do know that influenza will follow these rules, and we can use these rules of influenza to control it and reduce the spread of disease. So finishing up with why should you care and turning it over to Abby and other people on the line. Self-preservation. You want to keep yourself healthy. You want to keep your animals healthy. You want to live to see another day and be have a productive, long-lived life. 2, economics. This is a livelihood. You may milk cows for a living. You may have cows for pets or shows, but it's the economics of the virus. And even if the cow doesn't die, the amount of milk lost, even if the chickens don't die, so the numbers of eggs lost are an expense. Even if the pigs don't die, the time that they spend laying around, not feeling well, not gaining weight, that is a cost. And so there's economics to be thinking about here. And what's going to be your legacy, right? I was able to not get infected with influenza at my farm because I did this, this, and this. I was able to help people understand influenza virus and understand how it's diagnosis. What's going to be your legacy about influenza viruses? I'm going to stop talking now so we can get other people on the line and give you some more tips and things like that. But if you have questions for me, I have a funny email. It's grame003@umn.edu. And so email me anytime. I'll do my best to answer it. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to the next presenter. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Marie. Are you able to stay for questions?
Yes, I am. I'm here.
Fantastic.
Abby, do we want to field those type of questions now or wait till you're done with your pieces?
Excuse me. I think because there's very virus specific questions, a few now, I would actually like to address those now while it's still on everybody's brain before we shift gears.
Okay. So Maddie, if you and I can kind of shift here. One of the questions that came in is the virus survives under what conditions? How long will it survive in manure? Is there any research or anything that tells that?
Yeah, so the research on manure survival has been done mostly with poultry and with pigs. And again, it's a temperature dependent mostly. So if the barn is heated up or the manure is heated up and exposed, the virus doesn't live as long. And I can get you those exact number and pop that into the chat. But I've seen it's very temperature dependent. So the warmer it is, the less it survives. But if let's say it's around freezing, so 33, 34 degrees, the virus can survive in the manure for several weeks. I think I want to say 18 days is coming to mind, but I'll get that on the exact numbers and pop that in the chat or something that we can share. But it's been done in poultry and in pigs primarily, and not yet in the other species. It's something we need to study. Great question.
Okay, the next question we have here is, I'm interested in what biosecurity concern we should pay most attention to with showing horses at the county fair as people come through. Can humans infect equines through touch?
The human would have to be very sick and shedding that. And the equine, they are a susceptible species. They were on my slides there. Equine cases of human influenza, like directly from a human, have not been reported, but in a human carrying equine influenza from one horse to another horse is a way to do it. Like if they didn't wash their hands between horses, and especially if the horse was sick, because a lot of times we're dealing with things around the horse's mouth, right? Putting the bits in and taking the bits out. And that's where the influenza virus is being shed. But that's a great question. We'll get more into biosecurity in the next few talks.
Additionally, the vaccine that we commonly use in our horses for equine influenza is not effective for this strain that's currently circulating. So that's another aspect of biosecurity.
Another question is, what is the detection process for dairy and how do you kill the virus in milk?
Yeah, so the detection process in dairy, there's several ways to do it. One is to test the individual animal's milk. So maybe a cow isn't moving around as much as she should. Maybe her milk doesn't look right. Maybe she has a fever. Maybe she hasn't eaten very much. That particular cow, one of the best samples is an individual milk sample. And so what they do is they collect a little bit of milk from each of the 4 quarters and put that in a tube. And that tube of milk can go right to the diagnostic lab. So it can go right to the University of Minnesota Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, and they'll test it by a test called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. And that's a virus detection test. They say, does this sample of milk from this cow have the virus in it? Yes or no. So that's one way to test it. The other way is very early in the infection. Some of the cows, and this is reports from case studies in Michigan, Ohio, and Colorado, that I've seen, some of the cows, they are shedding the virus in the nasal swab, which is the way that we test ourselves for influenza. If you ever go to the doctor, and it's the way we test pigs for influenza as well. So a nasal swab would work, although they seem to have the most amount of virus in the milk. And the second part of that question was, how do we get rid of it in the milk? Again, heat. So pasteurization gets rid of the virus in the milk. And so the higher the temperature, the more successful the killing of the virus, and the longer you hold it, the more successful. So heat is a way to get rid of it in the milk. And then changing the pH of the milk. So making it more acidic, a lot more acidic, or making it very basic. Joe's typing in the chat. If you do want to do some testing, please involve your veterinarian, because that testing, the samples have to be labeled and collected appropriately. So it's like, I know the sample is from this cow and it didn't get spread to other cows. And then that testing is free as well. And your veterinarian won't have to charge you for the bill. And that's all covered by the USDA program for testing. So please contact your veterinarian if you have cows that want to be tested. Great points, Joe.
Okay, next question. Do we know how the Minnesota dairy herds contracted the virus? Movement of dairy or wild birds?
We don't know that yet. I haven't seen, personally, I haven't seen the epidemiology reports or the case reports, like people have gone in and tried to figure all this out. And I haven't seen the genetic sequences. I haven't been able to look at the viruses from the Minnesota herds to say, oh, it looks like it came from there or it came from there. So we don't have that. The most likely route is from other cattle, because when influenza viruses do move, one of the rules is a human influenza likes to infect a human the most. A pig influenza likes to infect a pig the most. And so most likely from another cattle source, but that all is stuff that we need to figure out when we do the full case investigation, go out, collect samples, sequence the samples, and see what came on the farm and what came off the farm. So good question, and not known yet, but stuff we can find out.
From the Q&A, there's a question. It says the transmission between birds, pigs to humans has been thought to be the sentinel event, but this seems to be a new event, birds to cattle. How concerned should we be about evolving or reassortment with cattle to humans?
Yep, and I think we should be concerned, and that's why I ended the talk. Why should you care? One of the reasons is that working with cattle, especially dairy cattle, involves a lot of hands-on from the humans. And so especially with that milk, if there's virus in the milk, that's a lot of hands-on with the humans. And so whenever you have a lot of virus that someone's exposed to, that increases the chance of that human to get infected. And so putting some barriers between the human and the animal are important. So in pig farms, remember, pigs have had influenza for over 100 years. In pig farms, some of the things we do is we wear gloves in between pigs. When I go onto farms, I always wear a mask to protect myself from the pigs and to protect the pigs from me. Because if I'm coughing and I'm looking at that pig really closely and coughing in that pig, I could spread the virus really easily to that pig. So I wear a mask, I wear gloves, and I always wear glasses, but that's just because I have to. So those are good questions there. Yep, but anytime we have really close contact between an infected animal and a human, we can have transmission. And that's what we're watching. So great question.
Okay, and then the last question in here right now is, I know of a dairy herd with it currently. How worried do I need to be about the beef cattle at my farm? Our hay provider works at the infected farm.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Joe, if you want to jump in on that one too. So far, there haven't been any reports in beef cattle. However, there hasn't been a lot of testing in beef cattle. But because it's bovine to bovine, that is a possibility. But we have some things that are going to our advantage out here is the beef are outside. So they're in a drier, sunnier environment, depending on the rainfall. And they're not as close together, depending on the situation, as the dairy cows. And the beef cows, in my opinion, and everybody who can correct me on this, but the beef cows aren't continually coming into the same source area time and again. So dairy cows are coming into the parlor twice a day, 3 times a day, and they're going to be exposed to the cow in front of them, the cow behind them every day. The beef cattle, they're out there, they're going to gather for feeding, and then they're going to go away again, or out to their own and stick with their calf or whatever. But if they're in a feedlot, yeah, they could be close together. So some things that could be done is that maybe the hay delivers hay first to the beef farm and then to dairy farms. So, and that's something we do in pigs all right away. We say, hey, my farm has this, and that farm doesn't. So go to the clean farm first and then go to my farm next, because I don't want to spread virus around. So we call that routing or changing things. So there's things that can be done, but it has to be, you have to talk and work through these things.
nothing to add. That was perfect.
I think that ends our questions for now.
Thanks, guys. All right, I'm going to mute and listen to the next talk.
Okay, I'm back. And now that you are sufficiently concerned potentially about and know more about H5N1 and what's been happening in our dairy and poultry industries, now let's talk about what we can actually do about it, right? So like I mentioned in my introduction, my expertise is in biosecurity. And so what even is that? Of course, my slides are not working. Here we go. Okay, so biosecurity, if you think back to your high school biology class, what is that the study of? It's the study of life sciences. And security ultimately means protection. So think of a security guard at a concert or a ball game of some sort. They're there for our protection. So biosecurity, by definition, is going to be life protection. But for our functional definition of it, it's going to be the steps that we are going to take to prevent or reduce the spread of disease. And as we begin to gather in community settings at our fairs coming up, that's what we ultimately want to do to protect ourselves and our animals and prevent any spread, or if an event is unfortunately to occur, that we can reduce its effects. And that's what we're going to do with biosecurity. Other definitions, just very, very briefly. It's not just the H5 virus that we want to protect from. There's many other viruses that are circulating. The poultry industry dealt with a different virus this spring in addition to HPAI. We also have bacteria that we can protect against. Foreign animal diseases. Highly pathogenic avian influenza happens to be a foreign animal disease, and that's why our regulatory agencies become so involved. It's because we want to try to eliminate that disease from our landscape in total. Other foreign animal diseases that you may have heard in the news that we do not have currently in the United States might be like African swine fever or foot and mouth disease. Those are other foreign animal diseases that would also necessitate a lot of regulatory involvement so that we can try to stamp it out as quickly as possible. And zoonotic diseases, if you're involved in the Animal Science Project, we've been teaching about this for years and years, and these are diseases that can be transmitted from animals to people and from people to animals. And influenza is one of those diseases. Ringworm is one of those diseases. Conjunctivitis can be, pink eye, those types of things. So there's lots of different types of zoonotic diseases. And biosecurity can help with all of these different types of things. So like I said, it's not just influenza that we're going to be talking about tonight, but it happens to be a current event that we're focusing on. So how does disease transmission happen? Really broad scale, it can happen with animal to animal contact. There's a picture of two of my horses actually, that they live together, they're snuggling. I wouldn't ever want to see this at any type of exhibition unless those animals were already living together and cohabitating. These two horses happen to live together, so I didn't mind it. But we want to be able to separate and prevent any animal to animal contact at any of our fairs. Our animal products. So right now we know that virus is being shed in cow's milk. We also know it is being shed in urine. Not that that's a product people would consume, but it's a byproduct of the animal's day-to-day life. Other animal species, here's actually a night vision photo of some possums at a poultry farm. We know possums and other mammals, raccoons, deer, cats, other mammals, all sorts of other animals can introduce disease to our domestic animals. Insects, mosquitoes, flies, They're great vectors for spreading all kinds of disease away, and human movement. And this is because we can carry it on our body. We can be moving equipment around, whether it's a pitchfork, manure fork, a wheelbarrow, some of our heavier equipment, like our skid steers, our tractors, manure spreaders, things like that. And of course, our habits. That's why I have a job, is I'm teaching you about biosecurity, is so that I can help you learn how to break some habits that might be introducing or spreading some of these diseases among our animals. So I'm going to break down biosecurity into 3 major portions, and these are all going to be, I'm walking through essentially the USDA guidance that's recommendations to minimize influenza transmission at dairy, cattle, and livestock exhibitions. And somebody will put the link to this document in the chat, but I'm going to break it down for everyday kind of people speak, okay? So before the fair starts, and I realize some of you have fairs coming up pretty quickly, but a lot of you have fairs that you are still several weeks away. Develop a biosecurity plan. And this could mean a lot of different things. What is a biosecurity plan for your farm in particular? Maybe you're just going to start with having a biosecurity plan for the animals from your farm that are going to be traveling to the fair and then returning home from the fair. Maybe your club wants to develop a biosecurity plan specific for your group of dairy goats or your group of poultry, whatever particular animal species that your club wants to write a particular plan for. Maybe your entire county 4-H program would like to write a biosecurity plan, and hopefully your county fair managers have a biosecurity plan for all of the animals that are on the premises. So what does having a biosecurity plan even mean? In the poultry industry, we actually have 14 different principles that are all circulating back to biosecurity. It has everything to do with training. Right now, that's what you're doing, is you're having some training on biosecurity, to what you do with your manure, what you do with fresh bedding and litter, and where you would keep that. What do you do with your stored feed? What happens with any spilt feed? Or mortalities? What happens with our mortalities on the farm? And how do you cross a line of separation or a clean and dirty line? There's lots of different components to a biosecurity plan. And so somebody can put in the chat box a link to the NPIP, which is the National Poultry Improvement Program. For those of you who are not involved in the poultry project, the NPIP is what our commercial poultry industries are using to guide their biosecurity plan writing. And they actually have the requirement that their biosecurity plan has to be audited by our state agency every other year in order to be eligible for any indemnity payments should they break with HPAI at any point in time. So this is a newer thing that the poultry industry has been learning about and experiencing since 2017. We started it here in Minnesota. But they have really great principles already established. So why reinvent the wheel? You can look to those biosecurity principles that the poultry industry has already established and read them, and then you can easily adapt them for any of your species. I personally have horses. That's how I got introduced into agriculture. And I also teach a biosecurity course for horse owners. We use the same 14 principles from the NPIP biosecurity principles that are already listed, and we can adapt them to our needs. So it's a really great place to start. For those of you who are in leadership positions or are on a county fair board, Michigan State University has a really great template that might help you get started for setting up a biosecurity plan for your actual exhibition events and establishments. And we'll put that link in the chat box as well. So the thing the whole thing with having a biosecurity plan is so many of you have ideas already in your brain. Like you already know, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to help protect my animal's health. Having a biosecurity plan is simply writing that down on paper so that you can share it with others, that it's not just something you do or a habit you do, but putting it on paper and then being able to share it with others, whether it's somebody who might be leasing animals from you, or they might be doing chores for you while you're on a very, very short vacation, because I know how most of us don't take vacations. But having that biosecurity plan written on paper so that you can share it. If you hire part-time help or you have full-time employees, being able to share that biosecurity plan as part of their training is really essential. So I encourage all of you to check out those NPIP principles and start thinking about it. Have some conversations with everybody who's involved in your farm or in your animal science project, and start writing some things down and be able to share it so that when the time comes, you all are on the same page. Those resources are available. Definitely check them out. The NPIP Biosecurity Principles, the Michigan State University Fairs and Exhibition Plan template. And then additionally, before the fair starts, know who your county 4-H educator is and how to contact them during the fair if something should occur. They will be your first point of contact should an animal become sick, should a person start showing any influenza-like illnesses. Contact your county 4-H educator, or for FFA kids who might be on today, contact your advisor. How do you know to get a hold of them during the fair so that they can then contact the veterinarian, the show manager, etc., the proper authorities. Also, if you are involved with leadership, you're from a county fair, know who your exhibition veterinarian is. Every county fair has to have an exhibition permit filed with the Minnesota Board of Animal Health. And through that process, there's a veterinarian tied to that permit. And those are also the people who are there on check-in day. And they are overseeing the arrivals of the animals, and they're putting their eyes on every animal that is at the fairgrounds that day. So for leadership, know who that is. Maybe you weren't even the person who hired that veterinarian, but know who it is and know how to contact that veterinarian who's on your exhibition permit, as well as knowing who might be your Board of Animal Health field inspector assigned for your area. In some cases, not all, some cases, that Minnesota Board of Animal Health field inspector might be your exhibition veterinarian. Some cases, it might not be. So on the Minnesota Board of Animal Health website, there is one of their pages that will help you find who your field inspector is for your county area, your small part of the region, or your small region of the state. And that link can be found in the chat box. So before the fair, animals need sick days too. And as disappointing as it may be, because you've been working on a project all summer long, or for the last few weeks, or since the day you had to ID that animal, but if any animals are showing any signs of illness, please keep them at home. It's for their safety. Putting them under the stress of hauling them and bringing them to the fair is only going to make them worse. It's going to drop their ability to fight anything off that might be present. So just remember that animals do need sick days too. And if you're noticing anything or you feel it's just not right, please keep them at home for their health, and then the health of your friends and your peers that would also be bringing animals to the fair. And we did hear last week that the Minnesota Board of Animal Health will be requiring testing for lactating cows before they go to a show. But that likely will not be in place. They won't be ready to have that, to be taking those samples until towards the end of June. So right now, that is not a requirement, but we wanted to let all of you know that have later fairs that that will be a requirement, and to be on the lookout essentially for an email from Sharon and her educators, or be watching the Minnesota Board of Animal Health website. You can sign up for their e-newsletter called Animal Bites on their website. And so be watching for that. That lactating dairy cows will need a negative test, I believe, within 7 days of their transport to a fair and a show and exhibition. So it's not a requirement right now. We do not have a date of when that will be starting, but we do know it will be towards the end of June. So during the fair, what can we do? Like literally, what can we do to help and practice biosecurity? And the first thing is going to limit commingling of animals from different herds or from different flocks or from different farms. This can look many, many different ways. There's going to be no one single answer to stop the commingling. So you're gonna have to think about how your day goes during the fair, and how are animals actually housed in the barns, to really be able to think about how can we minimize any of the commingling. If I think about how beef cattle and dairy cattle are stalled in the barns at my county fair, there's often animals from different farms, but they're stalled with the same club. So how could you maybe put a little bit more space between two animals that are from different farms, but you still want to stall in the same group and the same area as the rest of the kids from your club or your group of friends? So how could you do that? Could you put an extra space there? Could you put your tax space in between cattle from different herds? Are you going to put tax space between different clubs? How could that look? Can you put, how can you minimize nose-to-nose contact at tie-outs for the beef cattle? How can you minimize mingling at the wash rack? I think about our county fairgrounds, and our wash rack butts up, like the tie rail butts up right to the steel of one of the barns. So there's lots of opportunity for nose secretions to end up snot on the barn walls. How can we minimize that? Maybe somebody will hold your animal while you wash it, and vice versa. You would hold theirs for them, so that they're not tying and not having that opportunity to share some of those nasal secretions. Maybe it's an opportunity where you want to make sure that lactating cows at your county are last to be washed during the day, so that no other animals have that opportunity to potentially come in contact with a lactating cow. And then you can clean up the wash rack area after all of the lactating cows have been washed, and then you can all go to bed and be ready for show day in the next morning. Specifically, you will want to talk, and this I think happens more for our show coordinators, is talking with the judges and allowing some more spacing in a judging lineup than traditionally that you have. So you're not back to back to back to back to back with a cow's head. Spread out a little bit as much as possible. I know that can be a challenge with judging, and specifically avoid any of that nose-to-nose contact and a lot of extra commingling in any holding areas. And this goes for every species. We really want to avoid, with the horses, you know, you're hanging out next to one of your friends and the horses touch noses and they don't know each other, then they squeal and it's a big funny thing. We want to minimize all of that for biosecurity reasons. Because we know milk can be a major transporter of the virus, and that's where we are finding the virus, that leads to the challenge of how and what is the best way to milk those lactating animals at the fair. And the best recommendation we can give you from a biosecurity standpoint, if you are to bring those lactating animals, is to also bring your own milking equipment, and then talk with your dairy barn superintendent on the best way to dispose of that milk. There are guidances in the document about how you are to dispose of your milk, because they don't want any raw milk going down any public waterways, etc. So initiate that conversation with your dairy barn superintendent about what you should be doing with that milk if you're not bringing it home and putting it in your own bulk tank. If you are to use the public parlor at the fairgrounds, designate a single person who can monitor and clean, and to ensure, not saying they have to clean, but designate a single person that can monitor all of the cleaning and disinfecting after each unit is used, after every single animal, so that we can really ensure that all of the milk is cleared out of that system, and that there is no opportunity for any chance of any virus being spread to another cow. The secure milk supply does have a document, and I don't have the name of it offhand, but we will put it in the chat, and it is about handling raw milk and how it should be transported. And this is a document that is a little difficult to find in the secure milk supply plan website, but it's definitely there. So the link will bring you straight to that document. So if you are milking on site, read this over and just make sure that you're ensuring that like no milk can get dripped. We're not going to dribble any out of a can or out of a tank, etc. So especially if you are a dairy farm or a dairy barn superintendent, or you're going to be transporting milk from the fairgrounds, make sure you read over that document to make sure that you're doing it as safe as possible. And during the fair, as a public health precaution, consider postponing any public milking events that you might have, such as celebrity milking contests. The dairy princesses might be doing something. You might have your county commissioners come in, or a local celebrity, and consider going to a simulation for any milking demonstrations. I know they're a really great opportunity to do a lot of public outreach, but see if there's other alternatives, or another county or another dairy association that you could borrow a milking simulator from, rather than using live animals, merely for the public health and safety. And this, I think, is kind of self-explanatory. So sharing snot is not cool. So this means, obviously, if we see this animal should not be coming to the fair. But it also has a lot to do with wearing clean clothes, washing your hands, not sharing equipment, not sharing buckets. Just don't share stuff at the fair. And again, you saw this graphic earlier about not bringing sick animals to the fair, but if you are noticing any signs of illness or even heat stress that might be misconstrued as an illness, something's just not right with your animal, definitely make sure that you get in contact with your extension educator, that you can have the veterinarian inspect that animal for any illness if they are showing signs of fever, and then bring them home if that's what's recommended by the veterinarian. There are processes in place that will allow you to bring that animal home if you need to before the release date, but work with your county extension educator, your FFA advisor, if that's the case, and the veterinarian who's the official for your event, and coordinate all of that with them. That is a possibility, and we have protocols in place. Utilize the event veterinarian to manage any animals showing any times of illness. Again, 4-H'ers, contact your county educator. FFA members should contact your chapter advisor, and open show exhibitors, definitely contact your barn superintendent to see what the process is for your county with connecting with the veterinarian. Monitor your animals daily at the show while you're there. Of course, you're interacting with them frequently. You're gonna know if something's not right. That if their feed and their water intake is dropping, are they acting off? Is it out of the ordinary and it's not just show stress or being away from the farm? You will know, and especially when you've been working with your animals as much as you do to prepare for fair, you'll know something's not right. And consider taking body temperature. Some people like to do it, some people don't. I think it will all depend on the species, but have a plan in place. It goes all the way back to the beginning of my presentation of having a biosecurity plan. What will you do if that's the case, and you run into any of these instances during the fair? Clean and disinfect your equipment frequently. This is your brushes, your stocks that you're going to be doing any grooming in. This is your grooming equipment, vacuums, hoses that you might be using to water animals, drinkers that are there that you have installed in your barns. For horses, our bits, our equipment, our buckets. And wash your hands frequently, especially before you go eat at the fair. And each time you enter and exit the barn, you should wash your hands. Specifically, if you're going to another barn or you're going to go visit other parts of the fair. And this is something that all of you can do, and it would be very, very easy to do. It's going to be making sure that you keep each other accountable. So a group of you are going to go to a different barn. Oh, hey, guys, we need to wash our hands before we go, and let's check our shoes and our clothes to make sure they're clean. So here's one option that you could use and put soap on a rope. It's the county fair version of soap on a rope. This is just an old nylon stockings. You can go raid mom or grandma's dresser drawer. You can go get them at Target or Walmart and then put a bar of soap in them, and you can hang it from any of the hydrants, from the wash racks. You can hang them in your tack stall, whatever, but make it convenient to be able to wash your hands without relying on just the hand sanitizer that might be outside of the barn, or the hand washing stations that might be outside the barn. Take some responsibility before you walk out the barn and wash your hands. There actually is a lot of different ways that you could even build your own hand washing station that would be portable. And there's a YouTube video that we'll share in the chat box, and it's from our colleagues in our horticulture department, and they actually talk about how to build a portable hand washing station for vegetable farmers. Totally portable. You could easily put it in your tack stall. But then also, if you Google or even search just on YouTube, there's so many different possibilities that people use for camping when they don't have running water. So say you also play summer ball, and your mom and dad have one of those big orange Gatorade jugs. Use that as a portable hand washing station. There's lots of options, but the U of M Extension YouTube video will give you an idea of how to get started with that. Being selfish is safer, and this kind of goes back to the not sharing anything. Don't share equipment. Bring your own stuff. If people forget things, how can you clean and sanitize it before you allow them to borrow it? And how are you going to clean and sanitize it before it comes back to you? But if you can just be a little selfish with your tack and equipment, that is going to keep your animals healthier in the long run. During the fair, we wear clean clothes and footwear. And in the guidance from USDA, it even talks about, like, if you're going back and forth from home to the fair, to make sure that you do chores at home and then shower and change clothes so that you're wearing clean clothes when you arrive at the fair. One suggestion I'm going to make is, when you are going to leave the barn, you're going to go do fair things. You're going to go get a snack. Because we snack all day at the fair. Or you're going to go to another barn, you're going to go see some friends, meet up with some other family members that are there, and you're going to wash your hands when you leave the barn. Check your boots and your shoes. Maybe you have a pair of footwear that's for not in the barn. And then you just switch into them quick and you head out and go do fair things. Those are really pretty simple things you can do, or you're just gonna wear your rubber boots in the barn. We can work at this and have some pretty simple solutions. It might take a few more seconds, but it will be worth it in the long run. Some simple disinfectants that you can use. We can be using these for foot baths. We can clean and disinfect any of the equipment that you're using at the fair. You can clean and disinfect the stalls before you move your animals in. Simple disinfectants, you can use bleach. You could use One Stroke Environ. You could use Tektrol or any other type of really good environmental disinfectant that you would even be using on your farm currently. And finally, after the fair, you want to separate all of the animals that are returning home to your home farm for 21 to 30 days. This doesn't mean you have to have a separate barn. It doesn't mean you have to have a separate hospital pen, but you want to isolate them in a separate grouping from the rest of your animals until you know that they are truly coming home healthy. It is pretty inevitable when horses come home from the state horse show, they come home with the state fair crud. I have no idea if that's a thing with some of the other livestock species, but it just sort of seems like it's always a thing. So we want to be able to make sure that we can keep them separated from our otherwise healthy animals that are still being productive at home. And we want to keep those animals because you're reintroducing them to the herd and you want to keep them isolated for 21 to 30 days. And obviously screen them continuously every day for any signs of disease before allowing them back into their regular routine of being in the herd or in the flock. If you're bringing home any lactating cows, make sure that you milk them last in your rotation for the day, and ensure that you report any, clinical signs or any suspected illnesses that you have to your veterinarian immediately. And for us, this is going to be a challenge because I know so many of us come home from fair. We've been overextended. We don't get enough rest. There are so many environmental conditions, dust flying around. We generally get sick too. But definitely you need to remember to consult your healthcare professional. If you or any of your family members develop any influenza-like illnesses such as fever or chills, cough, sore throat, body aches, conjunctivitis, that has been in 2 of the 3 cases so far that we found H5N1 in people, or any unexpected tiredness. Like if it's continuing to linger or if it's more than it should be just from being overtired, make sure that you contact your healthcare professional and let them know that you have been at the fair, because, and it's not because we want, you're not going to get in trouble for it. But as researchers and scientists, we want to be able to know what's happening out there, and we want to be able to provide solutions over time to help keep you and your animals more healthy. So that's all I have for biosecurity. And you are always welcome to email me or call me if you have specific questions. Don't let my poultry title deter you. I am really focused on biosecurity for all livestock species, so feel free to email me if you have specific questions. I'm happy to review biosecurity plans. Don't all send them to me tomorrow, but I'm very willing to go through any of those types of questions that you have or talk through any situations or scenarios. So with that, I think we need to turn to the chat box in the Q&A and answer some more questions.
I think Joe kind of maybe wants, this maybe's for Joe and Abby together. A question came in, said, can farm workers be a vector? They don't need certificates of medical inspection to travel like livestock do. So is there some pieces just to summarize what happens there?
Absolutely, people can be a vector. There are reports that people have gone between dairy and poultry farms and have introduced things. We know from our experience in the poultry industry that a lot of the outbreaks are reported on Friday afternoon because the animals have got sick on Thursday, potentially from a weekend work crew that might work somewhere else. So absolutely, and it was actually on one of the early slides that I had, that people can introduce that unknowingly. So it's really important to make sure that you arrive in clean clothes, in a clean vehicle with clean boots, and if possible, change into farm specific clothing and boots. I know that's a little different than being at the fair, but definitely on farm, if you can wear farm specific boots and farm specific clothing, including your ball caps. I think that's something that people don't often think about. Well, I just wear a cap all the time. Well, have one specifically for the farm and one for when you're driving home and doing your errands.
Okay. Did anyone else want to jump in there? Or are we good to go to the next question? Awesome. Okay, so the next one is Wright County's dairy barn has a center aisle where the animals are face to face and the fence is only about 4 feet high. We will have to remove a quarter of the stall space to not have them be face to face. Do you have any other recommendations for people that might be facing the same situation?
Yeah, so this is probably a fairly common situation. There's a lot of very crowded barns. And I think one of the first things we need to look at is kind of the hierarchy of risk. We know that lactating dairy cattle pose the most risk because milk is so far in dairy cattle been the most infectious media and where most of the virus is found. So ideally, you would not have those animals face to face and they would not be able to touch. But how practical is that? Probably not very practical. What might be required is making sure that we try to put the lowest risk animals in those spots. So, potentially some workarounds for that would be to, if space allows, those would be non-lactating animals for sure in those spots. In addition to that, we could talk about pre-screening for people, then say, do you have the ability to isolate your animal when you go home? And if the answer is yes, and they're willing to do so, maybe those are the people that get assigned those stalls. So there's lots of ways around it, but most of it is just looking at risk in general, trying to figure out that risk profile for each animal and each individual home farm as well, and then making smart decisions on where animals go.
Joe, could that also be where they would have conversations around some other type of barrier between those nose to nose? If they're tying at those gates face to face, that they would have some type of barrier that the animals wouldn't be able to breach?
Yeah, the problem when we start talking about barriers in between animals, especially when we talk about somewhat outdated facilities and a lot of these county fairs, especially, and state fair included, is that you start to hinder ventilation.
Mhm.
And as we know, it gets hot in those barns. And you have to start weighing the risk of how hard are we making animals trying to create barriers, and how much are we preventing airflow, and how much are we worried about this? This is as good a time to say it as any. And this is my opinion. Make sure that everyone knows it's my opinion. Lactating dairy cattle should not be at shows. Okay, that is the easiest way to solve a lot of these issues. So far, Board of Animal Health has not said that that is required, but each individual show can make that decision. And for me, that is a great first solution and easy, low-hanging fruit to a lot of this problem. So that probably sparked some questions in the chat, but we'll leave it there.
Another question was, how do you manage barn turnover and pen clean out during the fair when 4-H is released and open class animals stay and come in, as far as disinfecting pens? For example, in this example, the llama and alpacas come in later in the week and are put in the pig barn pens. So there is turnover in a lot of fairs. So how do we handle the disinfectant and the time needed for that?
I think the solution comes back to that risk, right? So we know that lactating dairy cattle are the highest risk. That needs to be the focus of most of your disinfection efforts. And then, it's standard biosecurity, like Abby can talk to, like it's everything that we think about. Fresh bedding, clean out, downtime helps if you can. If you can't get downtime, then you need to disinfect. Cleaning being a very important step of all of that. Disinfectants do nothing if you have solids in the way. So we need to get rid of that first. And then it's being smart about where you put animals, right? I would not put, if I had my option, right, I would try to avoid putting animals where lactating dairy cattle were. If I don't, and then we start looking at risk, right? So if we have, I mean, as Marie talked about, influenza A can impact pretty much any species. So there's issues with that, but I would not put poultry where dairy was, right? So we can manage some of that. My big point in a lot of this is to involve your veterinarian, right? There's a veterinarian for the show. There's a veterinarian that should be involved in some of the planning. There's veterinarians in local areas that can help with these questions. So involve them, ask them to help with these plans and make sure that you're involving them as much as possible as part of their job.
Alrighty, the next question here is if people will be able to get a copy of the presenter slides. And yes, this presentation will be posted on the extension website, and I will share that out with everyone shortly. It will likely be up tomorrow. And then following that, we have, how will this affect the transportation plan for the counties to and from State Fair?
As far as transportation to and from the fair, we're not as worried about, airborne spread at this point, right? So when we're moving animals down the road, the scenario where we would worry about anything with transportation would be leaking milk, actual physical leaking of raw milk. When we're transporting animals, that's not a big deal. When we're transporting milk trucks, also not a huge deal unless they're physically leaking from the collection hose, because milk trucks are designed really, really smart so that they have several turns so that in their exhaust and their venting, so that there is no way for droplets of milk to escape. So it shouldn't change routes to the fair at all.
There was a question that if it comes to the point that lactating cows can't be at the fair at all, or if a county decides they don't want dairy at the fair, would there be an option for virtual submissions similar to what was done during COVID at the county or even state fairs? And I guess I'll handle that one. Is we haven't had that conversation about virtual yet. We have had the conversation that there's a potential that if the Board of Animal Health were to rule that lactating dairy animals would not be at fairs. We have already looked in to see how many kids just have lactating in their IDs. We would probably open an option for just those kids that have just lactating animals to take on another project animal or two. But we're not going to go there yet until we know more of a direction.
Looks like our next question here is, do you have any ideas for biosecurity in poultry show rings where cages are used by multiple birds throughout judging?
Again, I'll piggyback on Dr. Joe's concept of risk. So poultry animals, birds have to be tested, obviously before they come to the fair. They are inspected by the veterinarian. And if they did have influenza, they probably wouldn't be at the fair. But a best practice could be is to build in some extra time between classes. And I know it may be too late to do that for this year, but you can spray them, clean them first, get the organic material off, any feces, and urine, if any of that occurs during any of the judging events, and then being able to spray a disinfectant and allowing that contact time, whatever the label says. So if you're going to use this can of Lysol and spray the cages down, whatever the label says, if it needs to air dry for 10 minutes, then you need to wait for those 10 minutes between the classes. That can be a best practice. I think what's more important is absolutely cleaning and disinfecting when you're preparing for the show and after the show when things get put away for the winter. But yes, you could spray in between classes or events, but you have to build in that time. So it may or may not be able to be done for this year.
There was a question if we could have a Zoom presentation on extreme heat conditions. Let us ruminate on that one a bit, okay? Can dairy heifers carry the virus and potentially bring it back to the cow herd from the fair?
Yes, absolutely. So we hear a lot about lactating dairy cattle because that's the most impacted group, and virus is most found in milk. That does not mean that it does not impact other animals. When we first heard of this case profile for an infected herd, we heard a lot about mid to late lactation animals being the most impacted, and people said early it was not impacting heifers or any other animals, really. That's not true. We have more information now. We have more case reports. We have more people in the field that I've specifically talked to, and we do have some symptoms in other animals. So it is possible. It is less likely than a lactating dairy cow moving that virus around, but it is still possible. Like Marie talked about, there are positive nasal swabs from animals. We have reports of calves getting pink eye like symptoms from this, young calves even. So it is a risk for all cattle. It's just the magnitude and the ability of a lactating dairy cow to spread this around is much greater than those other animals. So again, we're back to this discussion of risk.
Somebody else just, what about dairy goats? Same thing?
Yeah, to quote Marie again, it's everything. I mean, influenza A, H5N1 can impact everything. So we do need to be watching all species. I would not be surprised if dairy goats can be impacted by this. We don't have any official reports of that yet. But we have to remember that back in February, we did have a positive goat case and several positive goats in Minnesota. So it is certainly possible.
Our next question here is HPAI has only been found in lactating dairy animals, correct?
And the answer is no. It's been found in a lot of different things. And so we've kind of covered a lot of that, but alpacas on the list as well now, goats, humans. So we have to cats, raccoons, bears, and just name an animal. It's been there.
There's been a big focus on cattle as far as extra security measures. And they said maybe they missed it, but should we be placing more attention on our poultry as well with this? Could we see restrictions on poultry this year?
As of now, no. But obviously, I mean, we do know that we have 2,800 kids in the poultry program this year. There are dozens that have dairy animals and poultry animals identified. And I really don't want to single them out, but they need to put a lot of extra effort into making sure they're clean going between those barns. Ensuring that your flock is healthy, you're not seeing any signs of any illness ahead of time. For poultry, I wouldn't be doing anything extra different unless you do have animals in other barns at the fair as well. Then I would be taking some extra precautions with washing hands, making sure your clothing is clean, making sure maybe it'll be easier to always wear the lab coat in the poultry barn. And then that's your clean species specific clothing, and have a different pair of boots or put on booties. It's a great educational opportunity then for all of the fair goers of why you're wearing disposable booties. But we've had cases, obviously, of high path in poultry since 2022, which has not impacted our exhibitions thus far. So I wouldn't expect anything to happen again because of our cases currently.
Alrighty, this next question, if cases increase in dairy herds in Minnesota, will the Board of Animal Health cancel dairy shows at fairs and other events, for example, 2015 with poultry?
I mean, I guess for me, as cases increases, yes, the chance of shows being canceled increases as well. Again, we're talking about risk, and the biggest risk animals are lactating dairy cattle, not only to other cattle, but also to poultry and everything else. So again, the likelihood goes up of lactating dairy cattle not being allowed at shows, and that coming from Board of Animal Health. I still am encouraging everyone uh, to not allow lactating dairy cattle at shows. I think it's the right decision across the board. So if you're in charge of an exhibition, I'm happy to talk about it, but that it's definitely my opinion on the right way to go.
There was a question, will lactating dairy goats need a negative test like cattle?
At this time, no. Again, we need more data. You know, I'm sure if anyone is interested and has a dairy, a goat operation, I'm happy to work with them to do some sampling, if that is something that you want to do, or if you're curious about it. I think that is it comes with some other things that we would need to talk about. So I'm happy to do that work with you if you'd like, and I can put my email in the chat.
There was a question, I don't know if, Maddie, if you saw it about the bedding. How safe is the bedding? I think they're referring to the show rings when it's not changed out during multiple species shows.
So when we talk about betting, again, we're back to this whole conversation about risk. Maybe we need to have a webinar just on risk associated with all of this. But uh, lactating dairy cattle, again, biggest risk. So for the betting, again, it's milk, raw milk being the biggest issue. Other than that, you know, if we're their rings are clean. They're pretty clean. We're cleaning up manure right away. We're trying to get through that, all of that. So as long as people are paying attention to PPE, like what we talked about with Abby with boots and the proper footwear, washing your hands, I'm not super worried about the ring as long as we're not talking about raw milk in the ring.
One more here, maybe a couple more. If towards the end of June, the requirement is to test lactating cows, would that not put them as a low concern?
If the requirement is to test and they show up with a negative test, it'll depend on the requirements for that testing. So what test is being run? When do you have to collect it? Where does that animal live, right? So if that animal lives in a population with other animals and they have to have a test within 7 days, or it has to be collected within 7 days of travel, then they still have 7 days to be exposed, right? So I still would, when we're talking about hierarchical risk, right? We're ranking who is the most risky animal to bring. It's still a lactating dairy cow, no matter what, even with a negative test. So that doesn't change. Their rank in the order of the list does not change. They are still high risk. They still have a certain amount of time where they could be exposed, and they could bring that to the fair.
One of the things that was shared out, that Abby had prepared was the contact list for the Board of Animal Health USDA field staff. And if you are, I just want to remind people that in 4-H, the way that we approach things like that at our fairs, at exhibitions, is that the family connects with your local educator. And the educator brings in the fair vet and the fair board for a conversation to see if that animal is going to be released. Yeah, we don't need families, all independent families contacting the field staff.
So the other question that has come up, and I think it in general, basically, it's all about what if we can't separate animals and we can't prevent contact between animals, right? That's just reality. And so, there's a lot of things that we're asking for that are really easy to say, and they're much harder to do. We need to do our best, and then we need to rely on the fact, like what Abby talked about, after the fair. There's a lot of things you can do at the fair, but there's a ton you can do to protect your herd and the rest of your animals after the fair with that quarantining of that animal when they come home. So I really encourage people to find creative solutions to that. Again, very easy to say, much harder to do. But again, involve your veterinarian at home too. Ask them what you should do. Have them help you figure it out. But we can protect ourselves from things not being perfect at the fair, because they're not going to be, by also observing that quarantine or that 21 to 30 days at home where that animal is separate. And that includes a separate equipment for taking care of that animal as well, just to be clear.
I just saw one last one come in. I think we've already addressed it. Is there a possibility that Board of Animal Health will have no cattle at all at the fairs? And I think you guys kind of addressed that.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, the most likely scenario is that lactating dairy cattle would not be allowed if things progress and we see more and more cases. I do not see at this time a scenario where all cattle would not be allowed, especially if we limit our risk by not allowing lactating dairy cattle.
We are at 8:30, asking for any last comments from Dr. Marie, Dr. Joe, or Dr. Abby, if any of you have anything that you want to kind of wrap with tonight. Otherwise, we really appreciate you being willing to host this, work with us on this biosecurity webinar, but welcome any last minute comments.
I just want to thank everybody for their interest and attention. The fact that you're paying attention and you're interested is really brings me hope that in the state of Minnesota that we can really do something about this. So way to go, everybody.
I agree. Thank you for the engagement, asking the questions. Our goal was not to terrify all of you, but we wanted to be able to tell you what's going on, and hopefully simple things that you can think about and consider as we enter this really busy season for the next 3 months, and be able to arm you, as well as introduce ourselves to all of you. Just because 4-H educator is not our job title doesn't mean we're not able to help and assist all of you. You're all producers, and that's part of our job description still. So please reach out to any of us if you have any further questions. We are absolutely willing to help. And I do hope that all of you have very successful fairs, and that you engorge yourself on everything fried, and that you can have all of the fun and smiles with friends and family as you navigate fair season. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, presenters. Thank you, Maddie, for being here with us, and Amber. Everybody, you've got contact information. Have safe fairs.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.